Not quite sure if the video cut off on the discernment and advice, so I'm just going to briefly talk about that in for a second. The whole idea here is that you should think with a calm head, right? Often we allow emotions to dictate our actions, and this can lead to disastrous results. So really, the whole idea here is to think sensibly, right? Think rationally. Allow your critical thinking skills to come into play rather than your anger, resentment, or what have you. So when we talk about domains of ethical theories could really be broken into two broad domains. And that is really the leader's conduct or theories about the leader's character. And we're going to talk about those. And we'll see that each domain breaks into a smaller subset, right? So for instance, when we talk about the teleological theory, this word comes from, it's a Greek word, comes from telos, which means end, goal, or purpose. And the idea here is that the leader's actions, here the idea is you're emphasizing that the focus of this ethics, right? The idea here is that whether a person's conduct will produce desirable consequences. So here we're thinking is you don't think whether it's right or wrong. The idea here is that are the consequences leading to a praiseworthy action? So in other words, think of something like manifest destiny, right? Or think about war, right? We find that countries will go to war for one main cause, right? That they truly believe is ethical, right? And the idea here is that they will fight and sacrifice the lives of millions of people for the sake of this action. So this is something that would be a good reference point, right? Versus the deontological theory. This really, it's derived from the Greek word deon, meaning duty. And the idea here is it's based on the idea that morality of an action should be based on whether that action falls itself under what's right and wrong, instead of just a consequence, right? So theological, consequence. Deontological, they're talking about the duty. It's your duty to do something that's right or wrong, right? So if you look here at this little chart, you'll see that here we have the teleological being broken down into three subsets of ethical practices, right? Ethical egoism, utilitarianism, and altruism. And we're going to talk about each one just a little bit, right? So when we talk about ethical egoism, this really states that a person should act so as to create the greatest good for her or himself. So in other words, this is a self-centered one, right? There's a high concern for self-interest instead of a high concern for the interest of others. A leader with this type of orientation, they would take a job or a career that they selfishly enjoy, right? Here, self-interest is an ethical stance closely related to transactional leadership theories, right? I'm sure you guys are not aware what transactional leadership theories are. We're going to talk about that a little bit more, but the idea here is that ethical egoism, it's really in the name itself. This is self-serving, right? So using the ethics for your own self-serving purpose. When we talk about utilitarianism, this is this states that we should behave so as to create the greatest good for the greatest number, right? From this viewpoint, the morally correct action is the action that maximizes social benefits while minimizing social costs. So this one is ideal, but once again, it is a hard one to really put into action, right? And when we talk about altruism, this is an approach that suggests that actions are moral if their primary purpose is to promote the best interests of others. From this perspective, a leader may be called on to act in the interest of others, even when it runs contrary to his or her own self-interests. So the idea here is that this leader cares solely for the greater good more than they do themselves, right? So in other words, sacrificing their life for the sake of the good, right? Maybe they don't agree with something, but yet they will do it for the benefit of everyone else, right? So why are these important? Well, really, these are based on the idea of virtue, right? Um, when we talk about virtue, focuses on who leaders are as people. The idea here is that virtues are rooted in the heart of an individual, and they're they don't have to be innate. They can be acquired through learning and practice, right? As we talked about throughout this whole chapter, the idea here is that behavior can be learned. And although we're born with certain traits that may put us a little ahead of the race, a lot comes from our environmental factors, right? Whether we have the support, the resources, the nurturing, etc., needed. But when we talk about virtue-based theories, here the idea is that you have to practice your virtue, right, from youth to adulthood. If you have someone who's able to teach you how to be ethical, then it becomes almost habitual, right? And eventually it's something that you not only becomes a habit, but you integrate into your life. It's almost like the learning process, right? The idea here is that we only learn things, you can be subjected to things, but does not mean you necessarily learn them, right? You have to, in order to truly learn something, you have to integrate it into your everyday life. It has to be something that's continuously there. And that's the idea here with virtue-based theories, right? You have to always be ethical. If you're not ethical, then you're not able to actually ingest it into your being, right? That's really the idea here. So we did talk about these ones. As I mentioned, ethical egoism. This really is an ethical stance closely related to transactional leadership. So in other words, this person is a leader because it serves them best, right? We're going to talk about transactional leadership later, but the idea here is that you do something for a purpose, right? So in other words, it's self-serving. And we already spoke about utilitarianism. This action maximizes social benefits while minimizing social cost. And this one really focuses on the idea of equality, right? We should try to do the greatest good for the greatest number. So here the idea is that the majority is what counts, not the minority, right? So although I did mention that it's about equality with the most people, which I feel is almost like a contradiction. So maybe you should forget that. But the idea here is that the idea is what will serve the most, right? So in other words, let's say that you have, let's say that you have 100 people who you're at a party and you're trying to decide what you're going to eat, right? The idea here is that let's say that 60% want pizza, while 40% want sushi. You're probably going to go with the 60%, right, under this type of practice, because it's what the greater good want. That's what the greatest number wants. So you're going to have more happy people eating pizza than you will with the 40% who end up with nothing, right? The most ideal would be altruism, which suggests that the primary purpose of anything is to promote the best interests of others. So therefore, this is a very very selfless leadership, right? Where they're truly concerned with the greater good. Although this is beneficial for everyone else, it can be a bad thing for someone, right? Because for the leader itself, because they're not really interested in their own interest or what is beneficial for them. They're interested in everyone else. So this is something that it is, this is a true leader, right? This is one that this would be somebody like Martin Luther King or Mother Teresa or Gandhi, right? The idea here is that these people, they sacrifice themselves for the greater good, right? So they're what you call serving leaders. So as I mentioned, we'll talk about that more as the class continues. But really, why is all of this important? This is important because, as I mentioned, leadership is influence, and leaders have a big impact on the lives of those that they're leading, right? As we mentioned previously, leadership, you're often involved in what you call like almost like a fishbowl complex, where you're continuously being observed. Because leaders engage with followers, followers learn from them, right? And the reason why it's so important that there's collaboration there, that there's integration, because you're both trying to achieve a certain objective, right? And the objective is organizational success. And that success may be rated in dollars or may be rated in a community impact or what have you, depending on the organization and its overall missions, right? But ethics is central to leadership, because this is really what, if you don't support ethics, then you're not able to really establish and reinforce organizational values, which is key, right? Because you want everyone to be as transparent and as ethical as possible. You want to provide a good culture. If you have somebody who is unethical, this can eventually lead to a toxic culture and therefore stagnate any type of innovation or growth from your employees, right? So in short, ethics is central to leadership because of the nature of the process of influence, meaning that you influence your leaders just by being there. You influence your leaders by being a model. They're learning from you. They're observing your behavior. They're taking what you take of interest, right? If you are somebody, you're a leader who does not supervise, if you're a leader who doesn't pay attention to their team, they will become disengaged. Leaders have a true impact on organizational values. If you don't promote those type of values, it's something that will not remain relevant in an organization and its overall culture. And with that, guys, we are done with chapter 2. If anybody has any questions in regards to this, please feel free to contact me. Yeah, and with that, we are done.